The winter of 1941 descended on Bletchley Park with bitter cold that seemed to seep through the walls of Hut 6 and settle into bone and marrow. Mavis Beatishi had married Keith in October, a small ceremony attended by a handful of colleagues who could not be told what the bride and groom actually did for a living worked. Through the seasonal darkness with a determination born of desperate necessity. The war had metastasized beyond anyone's worst predictions. Germany had pushed deep into the Soviet Union, laying siege to Leningrad and threatening Moscow. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor in December, bringing America into the war but also opening new fronts across the Pacific. The demands on Bletchley Park had multiplied exponentially as new enemies meant new ciphers, new intelligence requirements, new impossible tasks. But for Mavis, the focus remained the Italian naval enigma. Over the past year and a half, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to break into Italian communications, to sense the patterns and errors that betrayed cipher settings. Her success rate had become so consistently high that the Admiralty had begun planning operations specifically around the intelligence she provided, a level of trust that was both gratifying and terrifying. The morning of February the 12th, 1942, began like hundreds of other mornings, cold, dark, and filled with the urgent clatter of typewriters and calculating machines. Mavis arrived at Hut 6 before dawn, as had become her habit, preferring to work in the quiet hours before the day shift brought crowds and distraction. She found a stack of new intercepts waiting on her desk, messages captured overnight from Italian naval stations across the Mediterranean. Most were routine supply requests, personnel transfers, administrative traffic, but one message stood out. It was longer than usual, transmitted from Rome rather than a regional naval command, and marked with indicators that suggested it had been encrypted at the highest level of Italian naval security. Mavis felt a familiar tingle of anticipation. High-level traffic often contained the most valuable intelligence strategic decisions, operational planning, information that could shift the balance of entire campaigns. She pushed aside the routine messages and focused on this one, beginning the methodical process of frequency analysis and pattern recognition that had become second nature. 3 hours later, she had achieved a partial break. The message was orders from the Supermarina, the Italian Naval Supreme Command, to their submarine forces in the Mediterranean. New patrol zones, new protocols for attacking convoys, and something else. Something that made her breath catch specific intelligence about British convoy schedules that the Italians should not have possessed. Margaret Beatty had married as well, to a Scottish army officer who was currently serving in North Africa appeared at Mavis's desk with a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour earlier. "What have you found?" "They know too much," Mavis said quietly. "Look at this, they have our convoy schedules accurate to within hours. They know ship manifests, cargo contents, escort compositions. This is detailed intelligence, Margaret. This is penetration at a level that suggests either a high-placed spy or a catastrophic cipher compromise." Margaret studied the decrypt, her face growing increasingly grave. "Or both. We've known since last summer that they've broken some of our merchant navy codes, but this is more comprehensive than anything we've seen before. If they have this level of intelligence on multiple convoys, ... She didn't need to finish the sentence. Ships would be lost. Thousands of tons of desperately needed supplies would sink to the bottom of the Mediterranean. Men would drown. And the entire North African campaign, where British and Commonwealth forces were locked in a desperate struggle with Rommel's Afrika Korps, might collapse for lack of supplies and reinforcement. "We need to brief Deniston immediately," Margaret said. "And we need to accelerate the counterintelligence investigation. Someone, somewhere, is talking when they shouldn't be, or using ciphers that aren't as secure as they think." The meeting in Deniston's office that afternoon brought together representatives from multiple sections of Bletchley Park Naval Intelligence, counterintelligence, cipher security, and operational analysis. The mood was grim as Mavis presented her decrypt and explained its implications. "The Italians are reading our communications with a sophistication that suggests professional cryptanalysis, not just lucky breaks," she explained, pointing to specific elements of the intelligence they possessed. "They know things that are only transmitted through certain channels, which narrows down the likely compromise points. But more concerning is the speed at which they're getting the intelligence. Some of this information about convoy movements is accurate within hours of our own operational orders being issued. That suggests either real-time decryption or a spy with direct access to naval operations planning. Commander Deniston steepled his fingers, his expression thoughtful and deeply troubled. If we alert the Admiralty to change all cipher procedures immediately, we risk revealing that we know about the compromise. The Italians might realize we're reading their communications and implement security changes that could lock us out for months. But if we don't change procedures, we're effectively allowing them to continue reading our operational traffic. There's another option, said a woman Mavis didn't recognize, someone from the counterintelligence section. We use their knowledge against them. We feed them false information through the compromised channels. Make them think convoys are going to be in locations where they won't be. Use their own intelligence successes to set them up for operational failures. Deception operations, Deniston mused. Risky, but potentially more valuable than simply closing the security hole. If we can confirm which channels they're reading, we can turn those channels into weapons. The discussion continued for hours, weighing risks and benefits, tactical advantages, and strategic vulnerabilities. Mavis listened with growing unease. The intelligence war was becoming increasingly complex. A hall of mirrors where information and deception blurred together until it became difficult to distinguish truth from carefully crafted lies. What had begun as a straightforward effort to break enemy codes had evolved into something far more sophisticated and morally ambiguous. They were not just reading enemy communications. They were manipulating information flows, conducting psychological warfare, using knowledge as a weapon that could be more devastating than any bomb or torpedo. Finally, Deniston made his decision. We continue reading Italian communications as our top priority. Simultaneously, we implement a deception operation through the compromised channels. Feed them intelligence that seems authentic but leads them to make strategic mistakes. And we accelerate the investigation into exactly how they're obtaining our operational information. He looked directly at Mavis. This is going to require extremely accurate and timely decryption of Italian naval traffic. We need to know their submarine positions, their operational planning, their assessment of our convoy movements. Can you maintain that level of intelligence production? The question was rhetorical because they both knew she had no choice. Yes, Mavis said simply. Over the following weeks, the pace of work in Hut 6 accelerated to levels that seemed barely sustainable. Mavis was processing 20 to 30 Italian naval messages per day, each one requiring hours of analytical work to break the cipher settings and extract the intelligence. She survived on 4 hours of sleep, meals eaten at her desk, and a consumption of tea that bordered on alarming. The deception operation began to show results. False intelligence about convoy routes was leaked through the compromised British channels. Italian submarines moved to intercept convoys that weren't there, while real convoys slipped through undefended waters. The Italians grew confused and frustrated, their operational planning disrupted by intelligence that seemed accurate but consistently failed to produce results. But the cost of maintaining this advantage was measured in human exhaustion and psychological strain. Mavis watched colleagues burn out, saw people transferred away from Bletchley Park suffering from breakdowns or physical collapse. The work demanded everything they had to give and then demanded more, grinding away at health and sanity with relentless pressure. In March of 1942, Mavis decrypted a message that revealed Italian plans for a major submarine offensive against the Alexandria to Malta convoy route. 8 submarines would be positioned in a coordinated ambush pattern, designed to overwhelm convoy escorts and sink multiple merchant vessels simultaneously. The operation was scheduled for mid-April, and the Italians were confident of achieving a devastating success. Admiral Cunningham, informed of the intelligence through carefully secured channels, made a bold decision. Rather than simply rerouting the convoy, he would use the Italian ambush as an opportunity to destroy their submarine force. British anti-submarine vessels would be positioned to detect and attack the Italian submarines before they could strike at the convoy. It was a risky gambit that depended entirely on the accuracy of Mavis's intelligence. The weight of that responsibility settled on Mavis's shoulders like a physical burden. If she had made any error in decryption, if she had misunderstood rotor settings or plugboard connections, if the Italians had changed their procedures without her detecting it, then British ships would sail into a deadly ambush and hundreds of men would die. She triple-checked her work, reviewed every step of the decryption process, consulted with Margaret and Alfred, and every other experienced cryptanalyst she trusted. The decrypt was accurate, the intelligence was solid. But the possibility of error haunted her dreams during the brief hours she managed to sleep. April 20th, 1942 arrived with unseasonable warmth and clear skies across the Mediterranean. In Hut 6, Mavis and her colleagues listened to the flow of intercepted Italian naval communications, trying to piece together what was happening in real time as the operation unfolded. The Italian submarines moved into position as predicted, their communications revealing confidence that this operation would strike a significant blow against British supply lines. The convoy sailed from Alexandria on schedule, apparently unaware of the trap being set. Then British anti-submarine forces struck. Destroyers equipped with improving sonar technology, guided by intelligence about exact submarine positions, attacked with devastating effectiveness. 3 Italian submarines were sunk within the first 2 hours of the operation. 2 more were damaged and forced to surface, where they were captured. The remaining submarines, their communications frantic with reports of unexpected enemy contact, scattered and fled. The convoy reached Malta without losing a single ship. It was a victory that vindicated every hour Mavis had spent hunched over ciphertexts, every sleepless night, every moment of crushing responsibility. The intelligence had been accurate. The operational planning had been sound. British forces had used the advantage provided by Bletchley Park to achieve a tactical success that would have been impossible without advanced knowledge of enemy plans. But Mavis felt no triumph, only a hollow relief that she had not made a fatal error. More than 100 Italian submarine crew members had died in the operation. Men who had been following orders, who had trusted that their communications were secure. Their deaths were on her hands, as surely as if she had fired the depth charges herself. Keith found her that evening sitting alone in the grounds of Bletchley Park, staring at nothing in particular. He sat beside her without speaking, understanding that sometimes there were no words adequate to the moment. "I saved British sailors by condemning Italian sailors," Mavis said finally. "That's the mathematics of intelligence work. Every success means someone dies. We just try to make sure it's the enemy rather than our own people. That's war," Keith replied quietly. Not the sanitized version taught in history books, but the actual reality. Choices between bad options and worse options. Victories that taste like ash. The knowledge that survival often depends on someone else's death. "I'm not sure I can keep doing this," Mavis admitted. The weight of it. The constant awareness that people live or die based on whether I correctly identify a rotor setting or notice a pattern in message timing. It's too much. Keith put his arm around her shoulders. "And yet you will keep doing it, because the alternative is to let those deaths be for nothing. You have a rare gift, Mavis. You can hear things in those ciphers that most people can't. That gift has saved thousands of lives. Probably tens of thousands when you account for all the convoys that made it through safely because of intelligence you provided. You can't measure that against the deaths required to achieve it. They're incommensurable values." He was right, but the knowledge provided no comfort. Mavis would continue working, would continue breaking Italian naval codes, would continue providing the intelligence that shaped Mediterranean operations. But she would do so with the full awareness of what it cost, not just the exhaustion and stress and psychological burden, but the moral weight of being an instrument of death, however justified and necessary. The summer of 1942 brought a shift in the Mediterranean balance of power. Italian naval operations became increasingly cautious as they struggled to understand why their communications seemed compromised, why their carefully planned operations consistently failed. German forces began to take over more operational responsibility, bringing new challenges as German naval enigma was even more complex than the Italian version. But by this point, Mavis and her colleagues at Bletchley Park had achieved something remarkable. They were not just breaking codes. They were maintaining a comprehensive intelligence picture of enemy naval operations across an entire theater of war. Every ship movement, every supply convoy, every strategic discussion was potentially readable, providing British forces with an advantage that was beginning to shift the entire course of the Mediterranean campaign. In October of 1942, British and Commonwealth forces launched a major offensive at El Alamein in North Africa. The success of that offensive depended critically on supply lines across the Mediterranean remaining open, on reinforcements and equipment reaching British forces while German and Italian supplies were interdicted. The intelligence from Bletchley Park made that possible. Mavis processed dozens of messages daily throughout the campaign, tracking Italian naval movements, identifying resupply missions to North Africa, providing targeting information for British submarines and aircraft. The Axis supply lines to Africa were cut with surgical precision, while British convoys reached their destinations with surprising regularity. When Montgomery's 8th Army broke through at Alamein and began pushing Rommel's forces back across North Africa, the victory was attributed to brilliant tactics and brave soldiers. And those things were certainly true. But the foundation of that victory had been laid months earlier in a wooden hut in England, by a young woman who had learned to listen to enemy secrets whispered through encrypted communications. The winter of 1942 brought news that the tide of war was beginning to turn. The Soviets had surrounded and destroyed the German 6th Army at Stalingrad. American forces had landed in North Africa. British submarines were strangling Axis supply lines in the Mediterranean with devastating effectiveness. And at Bletchley Park, the flow of decrypted intelligence continued to provide the foreknowledge that allowed Allied forces to operate with a confidence that must have seemed mystifying to their opponents. But with success came new pressures. The intelligence was so valuable that operational demands intensified. More messages needed breaking. Analysis needed to be faster and more comprehensive. The staff at Bletchley Park expanded from hundreds to thousands, turning the estate into a small city dedicated entirely to the invisible war of cryptanalysis. Mavis found herself training new recruits, teaching them the techniques she had developed through months of painful trial and error. Watching young women and men struggle with the same concepts that had bewildered her in the beginning, she realized how far she had come since that first day when a simple encrypted message had seemed utterly incomprehensible. She had become an expert, one of the world's leading cryptanalysts, though nobody outside the secret world of Bletchley Park would ever know it. Her name would not appear in history books. Her contributions would remain classified for decades. The lives she saved would never know they had been saved. But the work mattered, and in the end, that had to be enough. On a cold January morning in 1943, Mavis sat at her desk in Hut 6 and began work on yet another intercepted Italian naval message. Outside, snow fell softly across the grounds of Bletchley Park, covering the estate in white that seemed to soften the rough edges of the utilitarian huts and buildings. The war ground on with no end in sight, but for the first time, victory seemed possible rather than a desperate fantasy. She decoded the message with practiced efficiency, her hands moving across the worksheets with the confidence born of thousands of previous decrypts. The rotor settings revealed themselves with familiar ease. The letters transformed from cipher to clear text, from meaningless gibberish to Italian words carrying military intelligence. And then she stopped, reading the message again to make sure she had not made an error. It was a routine administrative communication about submarine redeployments, nothing particularly important or urgent. But buried in the middle was a sentence that made her blood run cold. The Italians had begun to suspect that their naval enigma might be compromised. They were implementing new security procedures, additional layers of encryption, more frequent changes to rotor settings. The window of intelligence that had been open for nearly 3 years might be closing. Mavis sat back in her chair, feeling suddenly exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. If the Italians locked down their communications security, months of work would be lost. The intelligence advantage that had shaped the entire Mediterranean campaign would disappear. Operations that depended on foreknowledge would become dangerous gambles. Ships would sail without the protection of advance warning. The invisible war was entering a new phase, one that would require even greater effort and ingenuity to maintain the advantage they had worked so hard to achieve. She stood up, stretched muscles stiff from hours of sitting, and went to brief Margaret on the new development. Outside the window, the snow continued to fall, beautiful and indifferent to human struggles, covering the world in white that would melt within days, leaving no trace of its brief existence. Just like the work they did in this place essential while it lasted, invisible when it was gone, remembered only by those who knew what it had cost to achieve.